Section 8. As the time of General Synod's next meeting approached, I heard the whispered prediction, quote, "Mr. Steele will have his neck cut off at this synod," unquote. I have read and heard similar predictions, both before and since that meeting. It is one of the grand adversary's devices with which, through willing agents, he has always assailed Christ's public witnesses, Nehemiah 6, verses 12 and 13. But they have been enabled, every one of them, to say with Paul, quote, "None of these things move me," unquote. On my way to Synod, I attended a meeting of the Ohio Presbytery. It consisted of 4 constituent members, Messrs. Robert and John Wallace, father and son, Lusk and Steele, ministers with ruling elders. At this meeting, delegates to Synod were to be chosen. Mr. Wallace, Sr., and I were elected without opposition. Messrs. Lusk and Wallace, Jr. were both nominated, but as, according to the ratio fixed by our conventional law, only 3 out of 4 in a presbytery could be legally sent to Synod. Evidently, only one of the 2 nominees could be chosen. The vote was put for one and stood even. Then a vote was taken to the other, and the result was the same. So neither of the candidates was elected by the members of court. Then, according to rule, the decision devolved on the moderator. He gave the casting vote for his son. It was afterward understood that an elder had been recently ordained expressly for this emergency. I have described this case a little in detail, that the reader may understand one of the mysterious modes by which carnal minds commonly manage to secure what in history is called a, quote, packed court, unquote. A court consisting of illegal members, or so many corrupt members as may be able to reach carnal ends by the votes of a majority. General Synod met in 1840 in the same place where it had met 4 years previously, in the city of Allegheny. Mr. Lusk was admitted to a seat as a consultative member. By a rule in all ecclesiastical courts, such member has no vote, nor can he make or second a motion, but he is allowed to participate in the discussions. For some years, an impression had become quite general that the organization of the church by sessions, presbyteries, subordinate synods, and a general synod was unnecessarily complex, cumbersome, and expensive. The conviction of some, and their greatest objection, as already hinted, was that the existing state of things afforded opportunity for designing men to carry on defection through the instrumentality of a packed general synod. The Ohio Presbytery, in its reports to said court, had expressed its desire to have the delegation form of general synod legally abolished. I say legally abolished. This could be legally done only in the same conventional way by which representation had been restricted, namely, by the authority of the presbyteries. The change in the General Synod's organization appeared to meet with universal approbation. Indeed, some of the meetings in the Eastern Subordinate Synod had been of doubtful propriety or utility. All being apparently ready to take action in this matter, a special committee was appointed to report on the expediency of the contemplated change and the mode in which it was to be effected. Mr. Blackwood was chairman, and, on his motion, I was added to said committee. After adjournment, we met to consult and prepare the report to be given in the next day. No other members of the committee were present. I charitably assumed that the result of our deliberations would be laid before the other members for their inspection previous to its submission to the court. When the chairman and I met, and were ready to proceed to the business, I, of course, expected him to write our report, and signified my willingness to make any suggestions I could. Mr. Blackwood would not take the pen to make a beginning. I urged him, but he utterly refused, insisting that I should do the writing. I reluctantly complied. As we proceeded in the business before us, it seemed to me that the chairman was manifesting but little interest in our work. When I sought directive suggestions, he was mostly silent or answered in a monosyllable. The only suggestion I can now recall was in that mysterious, sublime style in which he was well known by his friends often to indulge. It was something about, quote, laying the subordinate synods on the shelf, unquote. I penned the report. It recommended the abolishing of the delegating form of the General Synod by the orderly action of the presbyteries from which it had derived its existence. The chairman offered no objections to the report, and I never knew whether or not he gave the other members an opportunity to inspect or amend the document. I confess to my surprise and some feeling of chagrin when, on the following day, instead of presenting to Synod our report, Mr. Blackwood offered the astounding and unpresbyterial motion, quote, that the delegation form of General Synod and the two subordinate synods be abolished, unquote. Whether this suicidal measure originated with himself, sua sponte et ex animo, and was devised with deliberation, or whether it had been concocted in secret with the aid of evil counselors, I could not know. But the disorder and tyranny which it involved were plain indications that defection was still in progress, for the outrageous motion was carried. Other evidences of a determination to continue the downward course might be mentioned, but all along I have endeavored to condense superabundant matter. One case, however, of tyranny and cruelty perpetuated by the lower courts and now sanctioned by General Synod must not be omitted. A member of the Church from the East, whom I had never seen, appeared as appellant from the lower courts, through which he had brought his case at great expense to the highest court of the Church in quest of justice. He had been suspended, as too many others, for, quote, contempt of ordinances, unquote. I think Reverend James Milligan was moderator of the session which first inflicted the censure, the same minister whose extravagant behavior has 1836 been already noticed. This man, by name James McKinney, I think, had, quote, stayed back from the sacrament, unquote. This was the whole of his sin and scandal. When the case came before Synod for review, the appellant in defense laid on the table a number of pamphlets, some of them published by several members of Synod now to be his judges. In his own defense, he stated that the moderator of session neglected pastoral duties, that instead of attending the sick or dying of his own charge, he would be away beyond their bounds and on a public platform, with all sorts of people lecturing abolition. Then he cited from the pamphlets the published sentiments of some of his present judges in vindication of his course, all to no purpose. His arguments, the very arguments of his judges and pleadings, were in vain. For him there was no redress. This case was by no means an isolated one. Mr. McKinney was dismissed as he came, wearing the badge of reproach, quote, reproached, unquote, as some believed, for Christ's sake. After the close of Synod, in 1838, I left New York with a heavy heart. The Venerable Reverend William Gibson was then on his deathbed in the city. It was the only time I ever saw him. The Synod paid special attention to the old gentleman. Committees were sent to visit him from time to time, as his demise was daily and hourly expected. The marked attention of Synod to this long and faithful testimony bearer was plainly indicated and explained by the minutes in which Mr. Gibson was reported as fully approving the position and proceedings of Synod. He had previously left in writing, when his intellect was unimpaired, his personal testimony against, quote, all confederacies for moral reform with the known enemies of God, infidels, heretics, unquote, etc., naming several such existing societies. This personal testimony of Mr. Gibson was afterward published as fully attested. It is true that in 1840 Synod did not proceed to the same excess of riot as before in New York, doubtless by the odium and disgrace then incurred. Some ministers had learned to be more cautious and discreet. Nevertheless, I then formed a deliberate and settled purpose that unless the course of defection should be arrested, through the assistance of divine grace, I would never again, but once, be a member in that Synod. Hitherto, I had never consciously transgressed the recognized rules of procedure in any court of the Church, nor addressed a brother in irritating or insulting personalities. In this statement, some yet living can bear me witness. Whatever others might do or think, I resolved at this crisis, and in as concise a form as I could, to bring before Synod a summary of the causes of our dissensions and alienations for the past 7 years as a final test. A true copy of that paper is here subjoined, and I trust it will never prove a stumbling block to any successor of, quote, Scotland's worthies or silly lasses, unquote. Preamble and Resolutions. Whereas it is the province and indispensable duty of this Synod, when society is in a state of agitation, as at present, to know the signs of the times and what Israel ought to do, whereas it is also the duty of this synod to testify in behalf of truth, to condemn sin and testify against those who commit it, to acquaint our people with their danger, and search into the causes of God's controversy with them and with us. And whereas it is the duty of synod further to point out to the people of God the course to be pursued, that divine judgments may be averted or removed. Therefore, resolved, number 1, that uniting with or inducing to fellowship by members of the Reformed Presbyterian Church in the voluntary and irresponsible associations of the day, composed of all religious professions and of no profession, be condemned as unwarranted by the Word of God, the subordinate standards of the Church, and the practice of our covenanted fathers. Number 2, that an inquiry be instituted in order to ascertain the grounds of the Lord's controversy with us in the sins of omission and commission wherewith we are chargeable in our ecclesiastical relations. Number 3, that the sins thus ascertained be confessed, mourned over, and forsaken, and our engagement to the contrary duties renewed, that the Lord may return, be entreated of his people, and leave a blessing behind him. This paper, of course, produced a sensation, but there was no attempt to cut off Mr. Steele's neck. No man was able to charge me with disorder. My standing at the moment was as firm as that of any member in court. But no sooner was the reading of the paper concluded than action was taken. Reverend Thomas Sproul sprang up and moved that it be, quote, laid on the table, unquote. He afterward confessed in print, quote, I knew that it was not strictly in order, unquote, to move for action on a paper not before the court. Why then did he violate known order? No doubt he feared and hated the paper, as he described it in print as a firebrand, for the instruction of those who had not seen it, and whom Mr. Sproul did not wish to see it. That firebrand will never terrify or burn any but such worldly professors as are symbolized by wood, hay, stubble. It was indeed finally laid on the table, but when the minutes of synod were published, an appendage was added to the motion of these words, quote, till next meeting of synod, unquote. Alas, forgery is not confined to worldly and wicked politicians. I readily detected the addition as a forgery as soon as I read the minutes recording the transaction, and I now declare again that the addition was not in the motion, but forged, either by the clerk or some other person. The Lord says he hates robbery for burnt offering, and I detest forgery. Therefore, I note this instance of it with reprobation. This degenerate body, however, next year, at Utica, Ohio, gave a quasi-endorsement to the falsehood by referring the firebrand to a committee of which Reverend William Neal was chairman, a novice of only a year's standing among them, and a course simply employed as a figurehead or tool. He soon learned from his superiors, parrot-like, to utter maledictions against the, quote, schismatics of the East and the schismatics of the West, unquote. But the parrot in a little time became an elephant on their hands. After traveling extensively among them and being everywhere unacceptable to the people, he left them and issued a pamphlet in which he chastised them with scorpions more stinging than the schismatic whips they had taught him to employ. Like too many among themselves, his pamphlet proved his ignorance of the principles and history of the Reformed Presbyterian Church.